Vietnam might have been television's first major issue, but TV would also play a major role in the 1970s and 80s in New Zealand's opposition to nuclear weapons. The New Zealand anti-nuclear movement was very small in 1966 when the French started atmospheric tests at Mururoa Atoll in the Pacific. But 20 years later, New Zealand would declare itself to be nuclear-free, and television played a major role in the change.
I think the government is insincere about the efforts that they make towards nuclear disarmament. Governments generally are.
Not necessarily insincere, but they just don't seem to be doing anything, that's all.
Government action wouldn't come until 1972, when Kirk came to power and attracted worldwide media attention by sending the frigate Otago to Mururoa to protest against further French testing.
I was working on the NZBC network news, the 7 o'clock news. Kirk had said that they would do this. They would send a protest frigate to Mururoa if they were elected. I wrote a paper to the editor saying, here's how we should do it, and you should send me.
Because this was a story of worldwide interest, the NZBC would also be supplying footage to overseas news agencies.
Very basically, why are you going and will there be any danger? And this is purely for the European. Anyway, most of them won't be able to understand English, so it's only 2 minutes.
Oh, great.
We shall do our utmost to ensure that the eyes of the world are riveted on Mururoa and what is planned to take place there.
Sean Brown's images wouldn't be the only record of events. On board the protest yacht Free, Alistair Barry planned to make a film of the voyage.
I had a wind-up Clockworks Bolex that I'd bought second-hand. The idea of taking a protest boat to Mururoa, sitting underneath the place where the bomb was going to be detonated, seemed a reasonable thing to do.
And then there was a fateful day, really, when the Free was seized. And I was on the bridge of the Otago talking through the radio connection to the guys on the Free.
You guys, this will probably be our last communication. They're about to take over the radio.
I remember the skipper saying, Sean, you guys, I think this is the last time we'll ever talk to you. Shh.
Does not speak.
So then that was it. They were gone.
The Free and her crew were taken into custody by the French military.
By the time the Free was seized, there was a genuine sense of outrage on board the Otago throughout the crew. And yes, we did go up and clamber up on the deck and shoot the bomb going off in the distance. And it was very powerful, and I think it really was symbolic and marked the beginning of really an attitude and a spirit in New Zealand that, with hindsight, you can see very clearly.
The other film that contributed to the change in attitudes was Alistair Barry's documentary, Mururoa.
The film actually ended up being screened on television at the time at 7:30 on a Friday night. In other words, prime time. Much more worthwhile than just joining a crowd in Queen Street with a placard saying, "Stop testing in the Pacific."
That one action alone will do more to awaken Northern Hemisphere consciousness to the injury that is being done to the South Pacific people than anything else we can do.
In 1974, France agreed to stop atmospheric testing. But 2 years later, the nuclear issue was back in the news.
Mr. Muldoon was elected, and one of the first things he announced was that there would be nuclear ship visits.
The images of Muldoon welcoming the Truxton into Wellington in 1976 spurred the protest movement into action, and Aucklanders began to get themselves organised for the arrival of the Long Beach 5 weeks later.
We developed this idea, or I developed this idea of a peace squadron. I had to come out as a spokesperson.
We really do hope that we can get the harbour so full of boats that there just won't be room for a big boat to get in.
Then we had peace squadron manoeuvres out on the harbour a bit later, so that is interesting to television.
Behind me is the beginnings of the Peace Squadron. It's not much of a fleet at present, but it's apparently growing fairly fast.
And the media always wanted to know, well, how many boats have you got? That was the big question. And we were relying on the exposure on the TV for people to come in and say, what do we do? I'd ring around my friends. I said, have you got a boat? Have you got a raft? Have you got a canoe? up a creek, anywhere, you know. So I was gradually able to build up the numbers a bit.
Each new arrival was greeted by a growing protest movement, and television images showed us all that it was ordinary New Zealanders who were taking up the cause.
Shame on you all! People went to court 30 years ago this
Television coverage of the protests would eventually cause the US ambassador, Anne Martindale, to put a stop to further nuclear ship visits.
All hell would break loose, you know, and all sorts of things would happen that you had no idea they were going to happen. And there was something really interesting for the TV camera to pick up each time. And then you'd be home in time for lunch.
But in 1983, a new US ambassador decided that ship visits should resume, and once again, the television cameras were there to capture the action.
They were pretty frightening times to be on the water in a small boat.
It was the only time in my life I seriously feared for my life, and I thought we were going to die.
And there was Kitch, my wife, and Minty and myself. Minty was well known, a hell of a well known. The police were watching him because wherever John Mindo went, trouble went for the police. I said to Minty, Minty, this is getting bloody dangerous. I shouted at him, this is getting bloody dangerous, mate. And Minty, as always, said, no, let's go in again, let's go in again. I says, oh, shit, Minty, we've been in 5 times. We're going to tip over and drown and get crushed by the bloody boat. Oh, no, let's go in again, he says, again. Oh, God. A wonderful time to be a New Zealander.
In 1984, National Party MP Marilyn Waring said she would no longer support her party's policy on nuclear ship visits, and Muldoon called a snap election. The Labour Party, led by David Lange, won and banned nuclear ships from our ports. The following year, the Rainbow Warrior sailed into Auckland Harbour.
The Warriors of the Rainbow, heroes of many famous campaigns, are now in Auckland on a new campaign to try to stop French nuclear testing in the Pacific.
And there were lots of people out on the harbour, despite it being a very cold day. There were lots of boats who were part of the peace squadron. Yeah, it was a big welcome.
As the Rainbow Warrior docked in Auckland, nobody realised that what would follow would result in the death of crew member Fernando Pereira, create international news, and help change attitudes to nuclear issues.
We stayed on board until about 10 o'clock because it was somebody's birthday. So that we had a bit of a celebration on board, and then we left and went to my folks' place. And the first mate called us at my parents' place to tell us that the boat had, I don't think he said bombed, but because we didn't know them, but the boat had been sunk, and I think they knew quite quickly that Fernando had drowned.
On day one, the view was that this is possibly just an accident. You know, a gas cylinder has gone off and some tragedy has happened. One of the things that I did was I went down to the protest fleet that was in the fishing basin, well away from where the Rainbow Warrior had sunk, and talked to them, and they were all quite adamant it was the French.
Greenpeace World Director Dr. Patrick Moore was convinced bombs were involved before the police were.
I don't think there's any doubt but that it was 2 bombs placed either in or under the ship that caused the ship to sink. The force of the explosions and the way the ship sank so quickly within 3 or 4 minutes leaves really no other alternative.
From the time of the bombing, the story played out on our screens like a whodunit, and more people came forward with clues.
You know, these sort of great news stories, those of you who work inside news and current affairs, you tend to remember them because they were great news stories. You know, adrenaline's running, fantastic story. But if you stand back and look at them a few years later, you see the significance of them and the influence it's had on the spirit of the nation.
Well, it was the first thing on the news every night for a long, long time. And I think it convinced the country that being anti-nuclear or being nuclear-free was absolutely the right thing to be.
2 French military agents were eventually convicted for their part in the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior.
In a way, the French contributed to this sort of singular, powerful, bold view of a nation by their actions, the very reverse of what they probably had hoped to do.
New Zealand's anger at the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior helped push the country towards declaring itself nuclear-free in 1986.